Have you ever wondered what kind of darkness could provoke the heavens to send a lone prophet into the heart of a hostile empire, risking death just to deliver a single warning? What if I told you that beyond the dust of time, buried in the sands of forgotten kingdoms, lies the tale of a civilization so merciless, so fearlessly cruel, that even the spirit realm trembled at their deeds? This is not just history. This is a spiritual reckoning, a lesson encoded in one of the most mysterious and misunderstood stories of antiquity, the tale of the Ninevites. They were not mere warriors or tyrants. The people of Nineveh mastered the art of domination, physical, psychological, and spiritual. Their empire didn't just conquer lands, it invaded the souls of those it subdued. The Assyrians, whose capital was the great city of Nineveh, etched their terror into stone. They flayed enemies alive, impaled thousands, and erected monuments to human agony. But what most don't realize is that their cruelty wasn't random, it was ritualistic, calculated, almost mystical. And therein lies the secret. Why would a civilization revel in such torment? What ancient energy did they believe they were unlocking? Could their acts of brutality be tied to deeper, esoteric forces, forces that shaped empires and drew the attention of divine messengers? In this video, we peel back the veil of time and stare directly into the storm of Nineveh's unholy grandeur. We'll explore how their cruelty was more than conquest, it was a form of occult power. We'll uncover why the prophet Jonah feared them so deeply, and why his reluctance wasn't cowardice, but spiritual resistance. And we'll trace the shadow of Nineveh's legacy, finding its echo in modern systems that manipulate, enslave, and spiritually devour. So prepare yourself, not just to learn history, but to awaken forgotten knowledge. Because to understand Nineveh is to recognize the ancient patterns still working through our world today. And once you see them, you can never unsee them. Let us begin. Long before the modern maps etched lines across the Middle East, there existed a kingdom whose shadow darkened the hearts of all who heard its name, Assyria. At the heart of this empire stood Nineveh, a city crowned in blood and crowned in splendor. The scriptures speak of it briefly, but beneath those brief verses lies a labyrinth of horror and hidden meaning. Nineveh wasn't just a city, it was a force. A pulsating hub of cruelty and control, built on a foundation of ritualized violence, spiritual domination, and the twisted worship of power. To truly understand Nineveh, we must journey beyond the Bible and into the realm of archaeology, ancient inscriptions, and lost mystical texts. The Assyrians were a people who perfected the machinery of fear. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Sennacherib boasted in cuneiform inscriptions about their brutal campaigns. These were not mere records of military conquests, they were magical seals, talismanic declarations meant to terrify enemies and invoke power from the unseen realms. They described how they would cut off noses and ears, gouge out eyes, and impale leaders in rows along the roads. They flayed men alive and plastered city walls with their skin. These were not acts of spontaneous rage. They were rituals, sacrifices to dark cosmic forces believed to feed off pain, fear, and subjugation. Mystics and esoteric scholars have long understood that cruelty, when performed repeatedly with intention, opens gateways, psychic fractures in the veil between dimensions. Pain becomes a kind of offering, and fear a medium through which power is transferred. Nineveh understood this. Their empire thrived not simply because of superior weaponry or strategy, but because they mastered the alchemy of terror. In every cry of agony, they believed there was energy. In every public execution, a surge of metaphysical force. This was cruelty as ceremony, designed to enthrone the empire as not only ruler of the earth but manipulator of the unseen. And yet, for all their might, something ancient within them feared the God of Jonah. This is no small detail. Jonah, a solitary Hebrew prophet, was called to walk into the lion's den, not to condemn, but to deliver a cryptic warning: "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." But why would such a civilization, so proud, so invincible, heed the words of a stranger? Unless, of course, they already sensed the shifting tides of fate. Unless, deep beneath their blood-stained stones, they too heard the whisper of judgment. Philosophically, Nineveh becomes more than a city. It is a symbol of what happens when power is divorced from compassion, when spiritual potential is hijacked by cruelty. It reminds us that darkness doesn't always appear as chaos. It can manifest in meticulously organized systems, sacred rituals twisted into tools of oppression, and civilizations that rise through the suppression of the soul. But here lies the deeper mystery. Why was this knowledge hidden? Why do modern interpretations strip the story of Nineveh down to a simple tale of repentance? Perhaps because it is easier to reduce evil to something cartoonish than to confront the truth, that evil, real evil, often wears the robes of authority, bathes in the incense of religion, and disguises itself as divine order. As we move deeper, we will examine how Nineveh's story was not just about repentance, but about a cosmic confrontation between a civilization rooted in blood, magic, and fear, and a divine presence that dared to challenge it not with a sword, but with a word. What we uncover next may change the way you see spiritual warfare, ancient empires, and the hidden forces still echoing through our world today. To gaze into the heart of Nineveh is to stare directly into the mechanics of ancient darkness, darkness that didn't hide in the shadows, but ruled openly in daylight, draped in robes of royal authority and divine right. It is here, in the very design of Nineveh's cruelty, that we uncover a terrifying sophistication. Their violence wasn't merely functional, it was psychological warfare fused with spiritual intent. Their rituals of horror weren't simply for punishment, but for programming. The Assyrian kings understood something that modern society still struggles to grasp, that the human psyche can be shaped not just by love or law, but by fear so absolute it rewires the soul. Every act of savagery, every severed limb, every mutilated corpse, every display of human anguish, was a symbol, a sigil, etched into the consciousness of all who witnessed it. These acts were deliberately public, exaggerated, and theatrical. They turned fear into a language, into a god. At the center of this empire stood their capital, Nineveh, a city walled not only in brick and stone but in spiritual domination. Towering ziggurats loomed above the city like watchful eyes, each one a temple to gods that demanded obedience soaked in blood. Ishtar, the goddess of war and erotic power, was worshipped with both ecstasy and violence. Sacrifices, sacred prostitution, and cult rituals formed the rhythm of daily life. And the Assyrian kings positioned themselves not merely as rulers, but as divine instruments, extensions of these celestial beings. Theirs was a state religion forged in terror, shaped by ritual, and enforced by supernatural fear. And yet, beyond the physical cruelty, something far more insidious was taking place: the manipulation of collective consciousness. Nineveh created a climate where violence became normal, even sacred. Where children grew up learning that flaying a man alive was not an act of madness but of divine justice. Where mercy was weakness, and dominance was the pathway to transcendence. This wasn't just a brutal empire, it was an indoctrinated reality, a controlled matrix of perception. The question then arises, how could a single man, a reluctant prophet from an obscure desert people, stand against this monstrous machinery of fear? Jonah's story, often simplified into a fable for children, is in truth a cosmic drama. His journey to Nineveh was not just a geographical one, it was metaphysical. He was being sent as a carrier of divine frequency, a spiritual disruption meant to unravel the psychic hold Nineveh had over its people. But Jonah resisted. He ran. Not because he feared death, but because he understood the cost of challenging spiritual tyranny. He knew that entering Nineveh was not simply walking into enemy territory, it was confronting an entire reality built on pain, pride, and power. He also knew something deeper, that if Nineveh repented, if they turned, the cosmic balance would shift. Judgment would be withheld. And perhaps, just perhaps, that part frightened him even more than their cruelty. There's an esoteric truth hiding in this tale, that even the darkest hearts, even those drenched in blood and bound by ancient oaths, contain a seed of potential, if they choose to awaken. And Jonah, perhaps jaded by the cruelty he had witnessed, doubted they ever would. His story is not one of cowardice, but of moral complexity. He carried the weight not just of prophecy, but of paradox. And then, something extraordinary happened. The people of Nineveh listened. They didn't mock him. They didn't torture him. They didn't parade his body through the streets as a warning to other prophets. Instead, the king himself stripped off his robes, sat in ashes, and decreed a citywide fast, from the greatest to the least, even to the animals. Why? Why would such a hardened civilization respond with humility and fear to the voice of a foreign prophet? Because deep within their blood-stained rituals, beneath the layers of domination and spiritual corruption, they recognized something true. Something ancient. A frequency that cut through the noise. Jonah's words carried divine resonance, and even the most entrenched darkness could not ignore it. But make no mistake, this was no fairy tale. The repentance of Nineveh was real, but it was also temporary. Their legacy, their spiritual machinery, and their alignment with darker forces would return. But for a moment, for one breath in the timeline of eternity, they bowed. And the heavens paused. To truly comprehend what transpired in Nineveh during its fleeting repentance, we must peer beyond the visible, beyond the ashes and sackcloth, and into the realm of spiritual architecture, the hidden mechanics of divine law and cosmic justice. For what occurred was not just the outward display of humility, it was a sudden rupture in the dark frequency that Nineveh had cultivated for generations. Like a cathedral built on haunted ground, the entire city was vibrating with the residue of blood rites and psychic control, until, in a moment of stillness, that vibration shifted. The scriptures tell us that God relented from the disaster he had said he would bring upon them. But what does that truly mean? In mystical traditions, divine judgment is not simply a punishment, it is a recalibration, a correction of spiritual imbalance. Nineveh, saturated in spiritual debt, stood on the precipice of annihilation, not merely through warfare or collapse, but through disintegration at the energetic level. Their cruelty had created a karmic vortex, a weight that could no longer be sustained. When Jonah spoke, he wasn't just delivering a warning, he was activating a metaphysical countdown. The city's response was a shock not only to Jonah but to the unseen forces watching from behind the veil. The fasting, the mourning, the tearing of garments, these were not just acts of sorrow, they were ancient technologies of alignment. Every great spiritual tradition acknowledges that fasting humbles the flesh, quiets the ego, and sharpens the soul's receptivity. When the king commanded the people to fast, he unknowingly engaged a divine principle. When sincere repentance is made, even by the wicked, it sends ripples into the spiritual realms. It confuses the demonic architecture. It momentarily unplugs the system. But here lies the paradox. Was this repentance truly born of transformation, or merely of terror? Was it a heart-level awakening, or an instinctive survival response to an existential threat? Esoteric traditions often distinguish between surface purification and deep transmutation. The former can appease judgment temporarily. The latter rewires the soul's trajectory. Nineveh's response may have halted the sword, but did it heal the wound? There is another layer to consider, one far more obscure. Some mystics believe that Nineveh's empire was guided by spiritual entities, beings who fed off the suffering generated by the empire's cruelty. These weren't fictional demons in horns, but energetic intelligences, what ancient Mesopotamians might have called Lamassu or Shidim, who latched onto civilizations like parasites, amplifying their power while feeding on their despair. When Jonah entered Nineveh, his presence, his frequency, would have been like a divine firestorm to these entities. The word he carried was not merely information, it was vibration. It carried a sacred resonance that disrupted the spiritual strongholds clinging to the city. This is why Nineveh trembled, not just in fear of judgment, but because something in the invisible world had been torn open. And yet, even after all this, after the sackcloth and the ashes, the fasting and the mourning, Jonah was angry. Bitter, even. Why? Because he understood something most of us miss. Mercy can delay judgment, but without transformation, the darkness returns. Jonah feared that Nineveh's repentance was shallow. And history proved him right. Within just a few generations, Nineveh would relapse into its old ways. The spiritual entities would reattach, the rituals of cruelty would resume. And the empire would fall, not by Jonah's word, but by the hands of Babylon and time. There is a chilling esoteric principle at work here: that which is not transmuted will always return. Pain repressed will resurface. Darkness delayed will demand payment with interest. Nineveh was given a divine reprieve, a window to shift its destiny, but it chose to decorate its cage instead of dismantling it. The empire's spiritual infrastructure remained intact, like a haunted house cleansed with incense but never truly evacuated of its spirits. The story of Nineveh, then, is not one of triumph, but of warning. It shows us that even the most monstrous structures can tremble at the sound of divine truth, but if the roots are not severed, the poison will bloom again. And perhaps that is why Jonah wept outside the city, watching and waiting, not for their destruction, but for a transformation he feared would never come. Next, we will explore how these revelations matter now, how Nineveh's patterns echo through our modern world, and what ancient techniques and spiritual practices we can adopt to confront these shadows in our own time. Though the blood-soaked stones of Nineveh have long crumbled into dust, the spirit of the city lingers, subtler now, cloaked in modern dress, but no less potent. Today, cruelty wears different robes. It thrives in systems of manipulation, in the normalization of violence, in the unseen forces that desensitize hearts and numb consciences. And so, the question arises, what does the fall and fleeting repentance of Nineveh teach us in the modern world? It teaches that entire civilizations can operate under a spiritual illusion, that cruelty, when ritualized, can become normalized, and that unless one cultivates inner awareness and spiritual discernment, they may live their whole life under the dominion of Nineveh without ever realizing it. The first step in breaking free from such dominions, both external and internal, is the act of inner fasting, not merely abstaining from food, but from thought patterns and behaviors that feed our own inner Nineveh. To fast from judgment, bitterness, control, cruelty, even the subtle cruelty we turn against ourselves. In mystical traditions, fasting is a symbolic death, a quieting of the body and mind so that the soul may rise. You begin to disentangle from the collective current and awaken to the presence of something higher, something still and divine, residing beneath the chaos. Next is the sacred practice of silence. Not the passive silence of avoidance, but the conscious, contemplative silence that allows one to hear the soul speak. Just as Nineveh responded to Jonah's wordless presence with dread, so too can our own inner empires of pride and pain be disrupted by the still, sharp truth that arises in silence. Begin by setting aside time each day, even just 5 minutes, to sit in intentional quiet, breathing slowly, allowing buried emotions to rise without judgment. This is spiritual excavation. You are unearthing what has been buried beneath years of noise. Then comes confession, not to another person, necessarily, but to your higher self, to the divine, to the spirit that sees all. Confession is not about guilt. It is about alignment. It is the sacred act of naming the false patterns, of acknowledging the ways we've allowed the spirit of Nineveh to operate through us. This is where transformation begins, not with shame, but with truth illuminated. From here, one must engage in conscious reprogramming. Speak words aloud that affirm your liberation from these invisible dominions. The Assyrians used public declarations as spells of domination. You must now use yours as declarations of freedom. Create a simple mantra such as, I break every unconscious agreement with cruelty, fear, and oppression. I walk in light. I think in truth. Speak it daily. Your voice carries frequency, your words are seeds. Also, be vigilant in the spiritual architecture of your home. Just as Nineveh had altars and symbols that encoded their city with specific energies, so too must you encode your living space with intentionality. Cleanse your environment, physically and energetically. Burn frankincense or sage. Place symbols or scriptures that speak life and clarity. Music, light, and silence all carry vibrations that can either invoke peace or chaos. Choose wisely. And finally, recognize that just as Jonah walked into the heart of darkness with only the word as his weapon, so too are you called to confront the systems and energies around you, not with violence, but with awareness. With presence. Your consciousness itself is an act of revolution. In a world that still praises dominance, cruelty, and spectacle, your stillness, your compassion, your refusal to participate in the machinery of fear is a sacred form of resistance. We are, each of us, microcosms of ancient Nineveh. Within us lie the thrones of pride, the temples of pain, and the chance for repentance. And just as Nineveh was given one chance to turn, so too are we daily given the choice, to continue in unconsciousness or to awaken, to flay others with judgment or to anoint them with grace. So now, as the echoes of Nineveh fade into the veils of history, we are left with a haunting revelation. The city may have fallen, but its spirit persists. It lives not in ancient ruins, but in our choices, in our silence, in our collective forgetfulness. The cruelty of Nineveh was not merely its brutality, it was its capacity to justify it, to institutionalize it, to anoint it with divine purpose and call it sacred. And in that mirror, we must dare to look. Not with fear, but with courage. For within every age lies a Nineveh, and within every heart, the whisper of either its rise or its repentance. But the story, though ancient, is not finished. It stretches like a thread through the timelines of the soul, through every moment you're tempted to harden your heart, to turn away from suffering, to choose comfort over truth. Nineveh calls not to be condemned, but to be understood. Its shadow is our own. Its repentance, though brief, was real, and that moment remains a sacred key. A city soaked in blood halted the divine hand. If that is possible, then what else might be transformed when true humility is embraced? Jonah's reluctance, too, is our own. He did not want to believe they could change. He did not want to be the instrument of their redemption. And in that, we find a final truth. Sometimes, we are not afraid of failure, we are afraid of mercy. Of the boundless, unsettling mercy of the divine that sees not just what we are, but what we could become. That kind of mercy undoes the tidy architecture of justice we build in our minds. It levels our pride. It forces us to forgive, even what seems unforgivable. So, ask yourself, what Nineveh lives within you? What rituals of cruelty, however subtle, still shape your thoughts, your judgments, your reactions? And if the voice of Jonah came to your gates, would you listen? The story of the Ninevites is not just a record of ancient sin, but a sacred mirror. And now, it stands before you. If this revelation has stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Reflect. Share your insights in the comments. Let your voice become part of this unfolding journey. And above all, remember, the divine is still speaking, and sometimes, it whispers through the ruins.